Have you ever wondered what it would be like to be stalked by someone? Having somebody that knows where you live. You notice a person more than you're supposed to, like they're following you around. You get weird phone calls in the middle of the night. You even notice that somebody's been hanging around your house, and you even see somebody outside your window, and they even know your every move. Now, whether this is an irrational fear or not, it does happen. And for the person that we're going to talk about in today's video, it happened for an entire 7 years that she was tortured by one person. Hello, my name is Jax Riley. I like to make videos about weird stuff. I'm also a musician, so I like making these videos as well. And my goal is I want to talk about not just weird stuff, not just supernatural stuff, but stuff that you're presented with the evidence and you have to kind of decide what possibly happened. And like today's story, it's pretty difficult. So if you like it, feel free to comment. And I want to know what people think, because especially today's video, I mean, I would have a hard time even telling you anything, even after explaining it. It just makes myself more confused. So let's get into it. So over 40 years ago was when these incidents would start. But before that, there was a woman named Cindy James. She was born Cynthia Hack, and she, grew up around Vancouver. Her parents actually moved around a lot. She had a normal childhood other than that. She had a couple siblings as well. Her father was in the Canadian Air Force, and in fact, they were going to move to France just right before Cindy was about college age. So she stayed behind in Vancouver and started going to nursing school in 1962. In 1966, she would graduate. And around the same time, she actually met a man named Roy Makepeace, who is a psychiatrist from South Africa, actually. And he was a professor, and Cindy met him there. And actually, before that, they would get married in 1966. But before that, they had actually started having an affair, because Makepeace, of course, was married at the time. And he, of course, divorced his wife and married Cindy, and not to mention the fact he was 20 years older than she was, which sounds like a great formula for a marriage, I know. But despite that, the two lived in Vancouver a relatively happy life, as testimonied by people around them in their life that knew them. He was, of course, professor at University of British Columbia, and she worked as a nurse with children at the Vancouver hospital. And everything seems to be ideal until September 1982, when they were separated, of course. And Cindy, she was almost 40 years old at this point. And one thing I've never seen people point out about this, but I've kind of noticed, is that she lived with her parents until she went to college. And then she went to college, and then she, moved in with Roy Makepeace because she was married. So this was really the first time she ever lived alone. And, kind of what a lot of us are scared of when we first move off by ourselves is kind of what exactly happened to Cindy. So just a couple weeks after being separated, moving in on her own in a house in a suburb of Vancouver, she, in the second week of October, I guess what it would be, she started getting weird phone calls that were obscene, violent, sexual. This person would speak in a weird, high-pitched, sometimes almost feminine voice. And sometimes Cindy heard nothing but breathing on the other end. And this would happen many times, a couple times a night, things like that. And Cindy would even, get one of these phone calls and get up and close the blinds in her house. And then she'd get another phone call saying, well, you think closing the blinds would stop me? Obviously, whether joking or not, this person had to have been pretty close and was truly trying to torture, scare her in some way, whatever this person's motivation was. But after this, Cindy started to notice some other things, and she woke in the middle of the night and found that somebody had been close to her house, close enough to break her porch lights with rocks. And the next week, she reported that she found that her bedroom pillow had even been slashed. These reports, of course, Cindy reported to the police, and a man named Patrick McBride was actually one of the men that came and investigated what was going on. And Cindy actually began a relationship with him, and he even moved in for a week. The relationship didn't last very long, but even Patrick McBride, while being at her house, noticed that some of these things were, he was noticing as well. Even he picked up the phone a couple times with and noticed this person with this weird voice trying to make these just out of the blue threats to Cindy, apparently. And even at the same time, Cindy and Patrick were together. They also continued a relationship with Roy Makepeace, her ex husband, because all three of them had the same interest in trying to find out who this person was or what they were doing or how to stop them, especially Makepeace, because I don't know if you've kind of noticed this yet, but like being as though this is just still like a couple months after they separated, like I would feel like Makepeace, of course, is the main suspect going on. So like if I was him, I'd be like, well, I really hope they catch somebody at least, so like I'm not the one that's mostly blamed. But we'll get into that later, of course. So around Christmas, Cindy got her first physical evidence, and she got a note that said "Merry Christmas" with a picture of a woman with her throat slashed in red ink, and she got this note on her, front porch. And all these incidents to this point, of course, if somebody caught this person in the act, somebody hanging around somebody's house like that, they could be arrested. But a lot of this stuff is not really a violent crime. And this would change in January 1983 as Cindy was found by one of her neighbors, her friend, lying unconscious with a nylon stocking wrapped around her neck in her living room, of course. And when she woke up, said she was attacked while walking to her garage, and two men had strangled her, threatened to kill her sister, and inserted a knife in her vagina. And I'm sorry, actually, she was found in her garage. Anyways, sorry. She would later be found in her living room too, don't worry. These calls and letters continue with increased aggression, and even Cindy had went to go visit her brother in Indonesia, and when she got back on this trip, she got a note saying, "Welcome back," as if knowing exactly where she was at all times. And the rest of 1983, Cindy tried to prepare herself as well as possible by moving to a new house. She changed her car's color. She hired a private investigator that was actually a well sought out security and private investigator named Ozzy Gaban at the time. And none of this really seemed to slow anything down as she continued to have these incidents that she reported. And in January of 1984, that same private investigator found Cindy lying unconscious in her living room, and she had her hand on the ground with a paring knife driven through the top of it into the floor with a note on top of her hand with the knife through it. And that note, of course, said, "Now you must die." And upon Cindy waking up, she had said that all she remembered was a man coming onto her property and hitting her over the head and inserted a hypodermic needle into her arm, in which people would find these needle marks on her arm as well to corroborate her story. Later in the summer of 1984, she reported that two men had gotten into her home and abused and bound her dog with a rope and left a note saying "Happy Birthday" on her birthday, of course. And even Cindy's mother would sometimes come spend the night with her, and she would report these same incidents happening, and had even said that Cindy had gotten up in the middle of the night and had noticed that the windows had been cracked, and they would hear the door, or Cindy's mom reported that she heard the doorbell ringing in the middle of the night as well. And Cindy was later in the same year in 85 was attacked and found with more hypodermic needle wounds, and once again a nylon stocking wrapped around her neck where she was found in a park as she was walking her dog at night, and this happened. After this, things kind of stayed quiet until later in the summer of 1985, when she attempted to commit suicide by overdosing on prescription drugs and was, of course, committed to the psych unit of a hospital, voluntarily, of course. And kind of makes sense if something like this is happening to pretty much anybody, being basically tortured psychologically by somebody. Psychiatrists, of course, would have different evaluations that we might talk about later. But obviously she was depressed and feeling like, is this really what my life is going to be now? Somebody's just going to torture me forever? Is there some end game to this? Am I ever going to see this person? But around this time also was, speaking of, seeing, we'll also talk about this later, but, Cindy had actually seen this person and saw glimpses enough in her last attack to get a composite sketch drawn. Nothing really came of it, but it's kind of a piece of the puzzle that we'll talk about later. And with this stuff continuing, seemingly somebody hanging around, and she continued to get phone calls, continued to get packages and notes at several different places, her house, of course. And this person would turn to arson as well, as Cindy came home one day and her house was on fire, and police would find burnt pieces of newspaper all around her house. Another day, she came home at night after walking her dog and found that her house was on fire again, and it had started in her bathroom basement. Of course, these fires didn't burn her house down, of course, but fire is fire. The fact that somebody had snuck in her house and lit her house on fire multiple times, and had seemingly done it with the intention that she wouldn't be home too, because she came home and had her house on fire. So knowing that she wasn't even home adds to the general creepiness of what was going on. A couple months later, towards the end of 1985, she moved to a new house in Richmond, which is another close suburb of Vancouver in British Columbia. Just a couple weeks later, she was found about 6 miles from her home in a ditch with a nylon stocking wrapped around her neck with more needle marks on her. She had apparently been found with tranquilizers in her and suffering from hypothermia since this was December of 1985. And this just kept going on, and her assailants really seemed to show little interest in killing her, even though surely they had ample opportunity to do so. And she'd already committed suicide. She'd even noted to her neighbors, her friends, the Woodcocks, or her once neighbors, that she had no longer really had a desire to live. It makes sense. I don't know how many people could have the resiliency to keep powering through something like this. I mean, I guess sometimes you don't have a choice, but I think it would take a psychological toll on anybody just from the fear factor of what was happening. But nevertheless, Cindy did continue to live life. She started a new job at a local hospital in Richmond, and things seems to be turning a corner a little bit. The disturbances slowed down somewhat, but then she started to report even smaller instances, like she found a hole cut in her basement window, and she found light bulbs loosened. A year later, in October of 1988, she was found unconscious in her garage, hogtied, naked from the waist down, with the nylon stocking once again wrapped around her neck. So whether or not things seemed to be going one way, it just kept going back to being found hogtied, tied up somewhere, that somebody had clearly broken in and got her and tied her up. And even people at the hospital she worked at would find notes, things like that. Security guards would find stuff that would say, "Soon, Cindy," "Sleep well, Cindy," things like that. As in 88 and 89, those things would continue to happen, and nobody would really be like, well, did we notice who dropped these off? Did we find cameras? Nobody even knew. But regardless, this threat proved true, as 2 weeks later, Cindy would go missing. And she went missing in the same day she went missing, pretty much, because the Woodcocks, going back to them, they had planned on her coming over, and Cindy would come sometimes spend the night with them. And Cindy, never showed up. She was supposed to spend the night, and the Woodcocks, knowing what was going on in her life, was like, well, she's missing. And this was a very astute observation, as they would go to her house, find it in pristine condition, but people would later find her car parked in the local mall's parking lot, and inside of her car they would find fresh groceries, a wrapped present, her wallet, and plenty of blood on the inside of the car. 2 weeks later, after this, in June of 1989, Cindy's body would be discovered in Richmond, about 3 miles from her house, near some bushes on the side of the road. She's found by a city worker, and I will show the picture of this. Her body was found very, very tightly hogtied around her back, with a black nylon stocking tied around her neck, with, once again, hypodermic needle punctures on her. So this really kind of seems like the end of her story. And technically, it is the end of her story in the sense of her being alive. But why is this unsolved mystery, you might think? Is it because they never caught the person? Well, they never caught the person that did it. But the question is, was there really somebody that did it to begin with? So, suicide's every story. And this is what makes this, from the first time I ever heard of this, I heard of it on an Unsolved Mysteries episode, the old Robert Stack Unsolved Mysteries. And from the time I first watched it, it was kind of like one of those things internally, like, well, I just have no idea what really happened. And of course, they never caught somebody. But think about this. In the eyes of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, they spent almost $1.5 million to investigate these incidents. Cindy had reported 80 incidents to the police of all these random things that happened to her in this 7-year span. Multiple hospital stays, police coming over, wiretapping her house, all this stuff happened. And the police never once found any evidence that somebody had actually been stalking her, or that a person had actually done any of these things that, the things like Cindy being found unconscious with stockings on around her neck, things like that. They never found evidence that anybody had actually done it. Now, could this have been a person that was just really good? Maybe. But the fact that they never found anything going on. So let's run through some of the stuff that she said. So a lot of times the police had reported or had said that they ran a lot of wiretaps on, especially in the beginning, on her house. They would be there and they'd be like, well, let's see if we can catch a recording of this person. And of course, it wouldn't happen while they were there. And as soon as they left, Cindy would call again saying this person called. Now, that could have been somebody with inside knowledge could have been doing this and like knowing when the police are hanging around their house. But the police would also set up people on the outside and the inside to, possibly catch if somebody was actually watching what was going on. Maybe they'd be able to find out who it was. Nothing ever came of it. And all these times, in that time back in earlier on, whenever Cindy in 1983 was found in her garage, and she had claimed that somebody had inserted a knife into her vagina. Of course, medical examination came back negative on any type of sexual assault or evidence of it. Now, granted, could she have just lied about that and told the truth about being, tied up in her garage? Possibly. But when people start lying about one thing, it kind of makes you think, well, they're really lying about the whole thing. Why would you, if you said a story that you were strangled by 2 men in your garage, why would you need to lie about, well, they also put a knife in my vagina? Well, I don't know. That's the good question to that. But they never found evidence of it. And in fact, there was a lot of other things that happened that was kind of like, only once did they ever find drugs actually in her system from supposedly a person injecting her with something with hypodermic needle punctures in her. A lot of times they never found anything in her system despite there being hypodermic needles marks on her, as if somebody had put the needles in her or she had put a needle in herself trying to make it seem like she did inject somebody with something. And sometimes they would found blood smeared on the kitchen floor in one of these incidents. I think it was the incident with the paring knife, as if been trying to cover something up, or somebody trying to bleed and trying to spread the blood to make it look like there was significant blood spilt over somebody doing something to her. And let's go back to Roy Makepeace, and we'll talk about this even further on in the video as well. But with Roy Makepeace, you think this guy's got to be a slam dunk suspect. And even Cindy at the very beginning did not say it was him, and said that he was no way he was capable of killing or torturing or doing anything like that. But later on, Cindy, under psychiatrist evaluations and sessions, she would say, and under hypnosis, she would say that one time they were on vacation in some Caribbean island, and he had murdered 2 people and chopped them up and threw away their body. And the police took it so seriously that they actually called people up and tried to find out if there was some missing persons cases in whatever that weekend was. She remembered what weekend it was, and of course nothing came back. And in fact, there was actually 2 people on that vacation with Cindy and Roy Makepeace, and they of course were like, well, I don't remember anything like that. Well, I mean, what would he been like? Oh yeah, yeah, I do remember that was. Yeah, I remember when he chopped up and killed those people. I about forgot about that. See, being facetious, of course, but I mean, even if they had remembered it, would they think they would have said, "Yeah, I remember that" from a straight up question? Like, "Oh, you don't remember that at all? You're just now coming back to you didn't report that at the time." I don't know. That was just a weird tangent when I was reading through this. It's like, where in the world did that come from? Like, if she was making that up, why did she ever think that was going to be like? Even if it didn't like legitimately happen, like I don't get it. But she would later on blame Makepeace and even say that Makepeace was the one that did it at one point. And we'll talk about this later, but she also had a composite sketch of somebody, and this person doesn't look anything like Roy Makepeace, maybe a little bit, but you know, would she have been like, yeah, that's him because I was married to this guy for a decade and a half? Probably should have been if it was really him, but she never did. She could have been trying to hide it, but she didn't really act like she was trying to hide the identity of this person. And a lot of this stuff kind of falls flat just because there's just complete lack of evidence. Because you would think if somebody that was this close to her house at all times would be like, hey, who's that guy running away from the house? And actually, that did happen one time when one of those fires, the Woodcocks went to Cindy's house as well. Um, they did see somebody running away after they saw him and like asked, "Who are you?" Could that have been the person? Maybe. Could it have just been somebody that was scared because they were just walking by at the time? I don't know. And talk about those fires too. You notice that, like, I said it was at nighttime, but this woman was walking her dog. This was actually at 3:30 in the morning. Was walking her dog at 3:30 in the middle of the night. Came home and found these fires were on. Like, she continued to walk her dog in the middle of the night. In fact, she claimed to be attacked in the park one time after walking her dog at night. Like, what person walks their dog in the middle of the night when they are being like aggressively stalked by someone? And maybe that's just her behavior, and she just wasn't scared of anything. But I feel like if somebody was literally being stalked, that kind of like makes you think, well, was this person just dumb, or were they possibly faking it? So let's get into what might have possibly happened. So let's think of the first thing. So the first outcome is, yes, all this 100% happened. She really was being stalked by somebody. All this stuff happened, and she was legitimately killed by somebody. So let's think about who the suspects are. So Makepeace, we talked about him. He actually had an alibis for the day that Cindy was killed. So police kind of ruled him out. And this pretty much happened every time. There was almost always a good alibi for him. And in fact, they had even found Makepeace in his car outside of Cindy's house one time. Patrick McBride did, and said he was trying to catch the person that was doing it. Now, that does sound kind of fishy, but I mean, I guess you could take his word for it. But they never did find any evidence that he had been any wrongdoing or really could have even possibly been tied or associated with something that happened, other than Cindy herself saying that she thought it was him. But I'd already talked about that a little bit. So, and Makepeace would go on and, I believe he got married again. I looked up his obituary. He would die in 2010 sometimes. He actually lived a long time. Let's also talk about Patrick McBride. When I first looked through this stuff, and a lot of stuff I'd seen never really mentioned him as being a suspect, but he was also a police officer, and I had mentioned before about the wiretapping thing. Maybe it was an inside thing. Well, maybe if he was the person that was doing it, he knew when the police was there and knew what to do to escape the police, kind of. I think that's a good idea. And also, I did look up Patrick McBride and actually found that he was kicked off the force because he was arrested for sexual assault, like just maybe 2 or 3 years after Cindy died. It was like 1990 or 1991 or something like that. And I'm not really sure what happened to him after that. He would die in the 2000s. I found his obituary as well, sometime in the mid 2000s. And he had even reportedly said that the person he sexually assaulted reminded him of Cindy James, because apparently he had some local notoriety for being the guy that was possibly involved with Cindy James for a short while. And the relationship didn't last very long, and that I think that would explain why things continued and got worse. Because I didn't mention this earlier, but Patrick McBride and her, they actually, had broken up. I think it was even before the year was over. Like, they weren't together very long, and it was around that time stuff started getting more violent too. So maybe, and the reason I don't like this as much is because, like, you got to think about the beginning. Now, does it make sense that he could have been doing it after that? But you're talking about maybe 2 or 3 weeks after. She didn't even know who this, like, he didn't even know, supposedly didn't know who she was. He came to start investigating these cases. Now, is it possible that he had met her somewhere randomly before all this stuff started happening and started stalking her and bothering her, and then just happened to be the police officer that was investigating this stuff, and then kept bothering her after that while still being on the police? Yes, but like, that seems like an incredible coincidence that he would have just happened to be the police officer that started investigating the incidents that he was actually causing. Like, that's pretty impressive, yes, but I don't know about that. And I would certainly think that if somebody had really done all this stuff, I feel like it had to have been the same person the whole time. It had to have been somebody that was just truly motivated, maybe not necessarily had something against Cindy, but had some infatuation with her that was just unbelievable, that somebody would have this type of motivation. So another weird thing I found was some people saying that they believe that maybe Cindy had had some type of lesbian relationship with somebody before that, and like, that's why the voice was high pitched and feminine, and which I mean, guess technically that would make sense, because maybe she didn't want people to know that she had a relationship with a woman, and maybe a jilted lover type thing. And that might would explain the obsessive, but I mean, you also, Patrick McBride and Roy Makepeace were like that too. Could have had that same motivation, and there's like less evidence than anything about that. I really can't think of, other than the phone calls being like more like possibly could have been a woman. Like, other than that, really, I don't see anything that could possibly make me think that that was the case. So I think if one person did all this, I think it was somebody random that nobody really knows about, because this type of thing had to have been done by somebody that was a true psychopath. Not just your run of the mill weirdo that like becomes obsessed with somebody, and not really the type of person like possibly McBride or Makepeace, or this lesbian lover person that could have possibly was in love with somebody and then was like jilted. Like, this isn't like the type of thing somebody like that does, unless they might have been a psychopath to begin with, didn't know. This is like a true, like, horrible person and true crazy person too, to have had that much motivation for 7 years to do all the stuff that they did, and had to have been close to her almost at like 24/7, like been following her around. Had to have been pretty much obsessed with her to have pulled something off like this. And I think it had to have been somebody that had met her, had known her from something else, maybe the hospital, or had met her at some point before and just found out where she lived and just followed her around. I think that's the most likely thing. So let's think about the other. I'm sorry, my cats are yelling at each other. Another thing that might have possibly happened, the thing that police believed, that she had been doing it on herself, or she had been, maybe not necessarily doing it to herself, but making it up to begin with, that type of thing. And like I said before, they never found evidence of something. Now, just because they never found evidence doesn't mean it never happened. But you would think that somebody being this close by to have been able to follow her around like this, they would have found a person somewhere. But they never really did. They never really had any leads on this. They interviewed people all the time. And something that is also pretty telling, that I waited till now to say on purpose, was that Another reason was that Cindy's death was not her dying of being tied up. She died because they ruled it a suicide because she died of overdosing on prescription drugs like she tried to do before. They found her hogtied with a stocking around her neck in a ditch, yes, but she had died from taking prescription drugs. Now, police multiple times when she had been hogtied, including when she died, had brought in not experts to say, could have a person done this on themselves, things like that, and went through, multiple investigations of this sort to try to see, not just who did this, but like, could she have done this to herself, and really almost all these instances could have been, but her death was kind of weird because, like technically she could have hogtied herself, and the not experts said that technically they could have, but it had been pretty much somebody that was as good at it as they were. Maybe she was good at tying knots, I don't know, but it, from both points of view, it's kind of weird because say Cindy did it to herself and she hogtied herself, so and she was a nurse, maybe she knew exact, like if she injected herself with like an overdosing amount of prescription drugs with needles and like intravenous injection, maybe she would know how long she had before she was pretty much like useless and couldn't do anything, like, and would drop dead. And maybe she knew that much and was like, well, I can hog tie myself in this amount of time and make it look like a suicide. But why would you do that? I don't know. Like, you're so maybe if she had kept it up for 7 years, she was going to keep it up forever and like just act like she was going to commit suicide and then make it seem like somebody had killed her. Maybe, but that seems pretty daggum weird to me. And like she would go through that type of level of effort to like just commit suicide and not be able to like be around to see what people thought of her, being killed by somebody. I don't know. But then think about it from the other perspective. If she had died that way, and somebody actually did kill her and injected her with drugs, like why would somebody why would somebody kill somebody that way? That's like kind of goes to my head. Like, why would somebody kill somebody by injecting them with drugs and hogtie them to make them seem like they committed suicide? But anybody that would have been intelligent enough to carry out all of this surely would have known that they would run reports to tell if she had been drugged. So, like, and they had found she was drugged, then it'd be like, well, she must have committed suicide. Well, there's the other discussion. Why would she have committed suicide that way and then tied herself up? So, either way, it's kind of confusing. You know what I'm saying? And another one of the better explanations I found that could really be what happened, probably my second best guess of probably what happened, and this is something extremely rare. Used to be way more rare, and then it became in the popular culture. There was a movie about it, or a movie with a person in it that had this, and then like suddenly everybody claims they have it, of course. But it's pretty rare. Very few cases, true cases of this, and that's dissociative identity disorder. Having a split personality. One of the psychiatrists had said that she had behaved similarly to somebody that could have a split personality. Apparently, sometimes it's brought on by a change of life event, some type of trauma sometimes. Could have been her separating. Suddenly she became a split personality. And like I said, that's extremely rare, but that doesn't mean it doesn't happen. So it exists for a reason. And one of her psychiatrists had said that he believed that might have been the case, that she had a legitimate split personality, which means that this could very well be the case of she really was being stalked by somebody, but it was her. So, which would make sense, given if she was able to do that hog tying by herself, then she could have easily done every bit of the stuff that I mentioned in this video. Even setting the fires, it makes sense. Burnt newspaper, maybe she lit her house on fire or put these burnt newspaper, the fire in the bathroom basement, and then walked around and came back and said, ooh, my house is on fire. She, knew people were checking in on her, knowing where to try to find out where she was, so she knew that, put the paring knife through her hand, somebody would come find her, or her stalker or her other personality would have known these things too. They would have known that she's stalking herself. And that's pretty crazy, but pretty much all the explanations in this story is pretty weird. And I think another thing, the third thing I would say, and this is what I think really happened. So I think the dissociative identity disorder thing very well could have been what happened, but this is what I think would happen. And I think that at the beginning, maybe for the first year or so, maybe not that long, I think she really was being stalked by somebody. Somebody really was after her, whether it was her ex-husband, Patrick McBride, some random person, her lesbian secret lover. I don't know. Somebody, I think, really was stalking her, because it's kind of a weird thing to randomly make up. Maybe not, but it's kind of weird thing to just kind of come out of the blue. I think that her living on her own and suddenly like not having a husband, and she of course knew people and apparently was a well-known person. Everybody liked her, but I feel like maybe she was being legitimately stalked by somebody and like found out the attention she got from it and was suddenly kind of like, well, this is actually not half bad, getting all these people coming through and like being concerned for me and like all this attention I'm getting. Maybe I should keep it up. And maybe this person stopped following her around and was scared of the police or something, and she never really was being legitimately stalked by somebody after that, and she was just kept making it up, and eventually she really did want to commit suicide, and that was just her grand plan. Maybe to me, I feel like that makes the most sense. Of course, that would have given that she would have had to commit horror murder suicide as well, which is one of the harder things to accept here, that she would be able to kill herself in that way. I mean, I personally think it's possible. I think her being a nurse would know about how to properly overdose on drugs, and then know how long you would have before the drugs kicked in. To me, I feel like that's what I'm going with. But if you like this video, I hope you did. I hope you found it at least interesting. You didn't fall asleep, didn't click away or anything, especially if you made it this far, I guess. So like and subscribe, leave comments. I would like to see, I mean, you can leave mean comments too if you didn't like it, but especially if you liked it, leave comments and let me know, because I kind of like seeing what people thought happened, because I really don't know. I researched this for a while and I still am kind of like, I don't know. So, and her death was originally considered a suicide and is now considered death by unknown event. So, they're with me on this, I guess. So, thank you for watching.